Okay, it's the next day, and our epoxy has set up, and so I'm going to give it a quick sand with an 80 grit. Usually in the recommendations and stuff like that on the instructions, it talks about anywhere from a 180 to a 220. That's totally fine. One of the nice things about the epoxy is I've even had times where there were some bubbles that got deep down, or even a fly crawled into it or something like that, and I just used my grinder and I would grind it out or chisel it out. The nice thing about epoxy is that I don't care what grit sandpaper or grinder or anything you use, the stuff just soaks into every one of those. And so it looks like you're gonna make a disaster of the top of your table here, and then you're gonna apply it back on and all those scratch marks are gonna show up. Not true. As long as it's clean, you gotta make sure that it's clean afterwards. So I've got 80 on there right now, and I'm just gonna level out the bumps, give it a nice scuff. What that also does is it shows me where any low spots are. Then I'm gonna mix my next batch of epoxy. And in this case, I think this will be our last coat. And I continue to do coats until it gives me a nice equal, flat, uniform finish, and where nothing has ever dipped down or gone in. So I only see a few spots where a couple of these cracks were a little bit more hungry than the amount of epoxy, amount of non-set epoxy around them. So you'll see when I sand this, those will kind of stand out. And I'll go, when I do the pour, rather than pour it all on, I'll just pour a little bit over each one of those. And then I'll sit and watch it for a second to see if anything's going down. And once I see that it's not, then I kind of pour the rest on, and then I flood it all out. As opposed to putting it all on and then having like a flat surface where the epoxy around that starts to sink into it. You're trying to get all the epoxy then to self-level afterwards. And depending on how fast it sets, it may or may not do that. So I start by filling those holes or the places first, and then I flood coat it afterwards. So yeah, let's do it. Okay, so you can see I've sanded this all down. Maybe you can see from the camera or not, but there's a few spots where you can see that there's low spots. They're really minor. This was a really good pour. There's not too many divots at all. I'm just in the final stages of kind of mixing this stuff up and getting it ready to go. And then we're gonna not pour it on, but I'm gonna drip it on the spots that had some low spots. And it's a sloppy deal, like, you know, like there's not a real, I mean, I guess you could use a syringe or something like that and be precise about it, but because we're flood coating the whole thing anyways, it's not that big of a deal. So just get it all over, it doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to find any of the spots that were low, even if they're a tiny bit, and I'm just gonna let it sit there for a second and let it soak up this stuff that I'm putting on top. And then I'll flood coat it, just to make sure that these holes that were thirsty got as much as they wanted to drink. There's really not a lot, like on this one, it's almost an unnecessary step, but it only takes a few seconds, so no harm, no foul. And then I'm just gonna look for a sec. So this one was actually the deepest one, which wasn't that bad at all. And I can see a few air bubbles have already come out of it, which means this stuff has gone down inside. And apart from that, I think we've pretty much got it all. I don't see any more real thirsty spots. So from here, I'm gonna go ahead and pour it all back on again. Same as the first seal coat, and I'll work my way from the inside towards the outside again. Same as the first coat, I'm gonna use my hand, just sort of work this stuff in along the edges. I don't know how much you can see through the camera, but there's significantly less bubbles coming out now, which is to be expected because we've plugged the vast majority of the holes and there's only a few spots left that even wanted some. So I'm gonna grab the torch and pop these bubbles. So it's only been a few minutes later, and this stuff is really leveled out nice. You can see if I kind of get down close here how level that top and how glass-like that top is all the way along. You see these little drips across the bottom too. Like I said, I rub those in with my hand as I go along, as I wait here for about half an hour to make sure no bubbles come out. And you can sand them off afterwards. But in this state, it is super, super glossy. And I don't like that for the rustic furniture. So I end up sanding that off, which is something I'll show you here coming up once this stuff sets up and I put a satin finish on it. But it sure levels out nice. Okay, we're switching it up a little bit. I'm going to do it with my cool truck on the wall in the background, so in case you get tired of looking at my ugly face, you can stare at that cool truck that my buddy Wayne Dick made me. Now what we're going to do is sand this down. See how it's super glossy? It's all set up. It's super smooth. It's super nice. I'm super happy with it. All the marks that you already see on there are actually from me rubbing my hand all over it, telling it how beautiful and wonderful it is. And now it's time to sand that gloss off, and then I'm going to put polyurethane on top. So 150, and I think I'll do 150, then 220. And I'm just lightly sanding it, making sure that I'm taking off the gloss. There's no real secret to it, but here it goes. Okay, 150, 220, we've got it all sanded down. One thing that you're looking for right here is you want to have a nice uniform sand. If you sand it different, how do I say this? If when you sanded it, it was in an irregular pattern, or there were some areas that were sanded heavier or deeper, or got into another layer of epoxy or something like that, and there was a ring, when you go put your finish on, that will show up. So here's a real world example. I didn't have to do it on this one, but let's say instead of just 2 coats of epoxy, you ended up having to do 3 because there were a few little spots left over. And so instead of floating the entire thing, you just came back and did a few little touch-ups. What happens sometimes is where that last little pour of epoxy went on, if it wasn't sanded right around the other epoxy, then it creates kind of a little ring, a little weird, like irregular bond ring. And when you sand that, then there's that little circle around. And when you go to put your clear epoxy on top of, that'll show up. So it is important to do that. In fact, in most cases, if I have to come back and do a touch-up, like there's a couple spots that were too low, I will re-flood coat the entire thing. Like, not very thick, but I'll fill that 1 or 2 areas, and I'll go over the entire thing once again, so it's actually like it cures all at the same time. Really quickly, when we're talking about sanding, and it's not just for epoxy, it's in between layers. Why do we sand in between layers? You've heard me say it before. One of them is to knock down all the bumps and all the high areas so you have a smooth finish. And second is, if you don't sand, your next application of whatever finish has nothing to hold on to. Like, you can imagine a rock climber when he's climbing up a wall, he needs something to hold on to. If it was just a flat piece of granite, he's got nothing to hold on to. I mean, it's kind of a stupid analogy, but whatever the next finish is, it wants to kind of sink and grab onto something. And the little scratches that you make with your sandpaper are what it grabs onto. Some finishes actually chemically bond to one another, and you don't have to sand in between, like some of the waxes, Oi's oil and stuff like that. Others, you have to do it at a sweet spot. So epoxy is a good example. When you get to like 4 hours on this one, when it's just kind of tacky but not set up yet, you could actually pour right over top, and that top layer will adhere to the bottom layer as if they were poured at the same time. Yeah, so now I'm actually going to wipe this all down with water, clean it all off. I'm going to put it on time lapse because it's kind of cool when I do it and then the water dries. I don't know, I think it's cool. And then I'm going to put polyurethane on. And I'm actually going to spray this layer on. In some cases I would just brush the first layer on and sand it, but this one's turning out really nice. This last epoxy pour, it's looking really good. So the only thing the polyurethane is doing for me right now is providing the satin finish that I want for the barnwood table. I just don't want the gloss. Okay, time to put some polyurethane on. So we are going to use this Varathane interior satin polyurethane. This stuff is for furniture finishes. I will have a link in the description down below, the stuff that you can buy to get this. A couple things to keep in mind. The difference between satin, semi-gloss, and gloss is not the stuff in there, it's actually the amount of sand in here. So you do want to mix this up, shake this up, dance with it, whatever you do, and then get it into your sprayer or before you brush it on, because that's what actually makes this stuff satin. If all the sand sinks down to the bottom and then you pick the stuff off the top, you're essentially picking the gloss off the top and it doesn't have any sand in it. The sand, from what I understand, just refracts the light, and that's what makes it satin. So I am going to spray this stuff on. This sprayer I got at some cheap store in town. It's a piece of crap, to be real honest with you, and I'm going to buy a new one. and then I'll tell you about it, but this one does the job right now. Essentially all we're trying to do is use the pressure of some air and some of this polyurethane coming out and spray it out. It's a piece of crap, not because it doesn't lay down a nice coat, it's just the nozzle isn't quite wide enough, it doesn't adjust very well. But do yourself a favor no matter what and put a water separator on it. If you don't have one coming off of your compressor, I have one here right before it hits the gun where the water gets separated out. They're cheap, they're replaceable, and then you never end up with some water spurting out on top of your finish, especially once you get like the fourth or fifth or last little pass, and then you end up doing that. I'm going to go in two directions on this one just to get kind of a full coverage. I'm going to go this way and then I'm going to go that way, east, south, and east, west, north, south. I'm all screwed up today. And I'll actually probably do two. So I'll wait till it's kind of settled down a little bit and come spray one more coat on it while it's still wet. And with any luck, that's all I'll need and I'll be done. So I'll put on this sexy mask and spray this. Whoa, okay, Dusty, so what happened there? All right, as I mentioned, that sprayer's a piece of crap, and you saw me messing around with it and trying to adjust it and everything, and it sucked. There wasn't enough spray coming out. There was more air than spray, and I couldn't adjust it right, and so it was drying the stuff as it was coming out, and it just wasn't laying down a very consistent product. So I could edit this out and pretend like it all went well, but this is kind of woodworking, this is the way it goes. But the principle is that what we're trying to do right here is get an even layer of polyurethane over top of it. I was hoping to do it with the spray. One of the reasons I like the spray is because it lays down a nice even layer without any brush marks. When you put something on with a brush, if it's not self-leveling, then you start to make a bunch of little waves, little bumps where you put the brush down. If you put it on thick enough, and before it sets up, then those little bumps that the brush makes, they level out. And if you can get it to do that, like you can kind of see right now that this stuff is leveling out. I really can't see much in terms of brush marks, except in a few spots. Although I'm under no illusion that this is gonna all level out perfectly, but I am gonna come back and sand it out perfectly. So anywhere where there was a high spot, I'll do that. And hopefully by then I've got a different sprayer. In fact, if you know a good sprayer, then you set me a comment down below that tells me which sprayer you like. Otherwise, I'm going to be on the lookout for one. But look, that's woodworking. That's how it goes. I called an audible halfway through, switched to the brush. Luckily, the stuff hadn't set up quite enough. I was sort of on the edge. But I've laid down a pretty good coat here. I'm happy enough with it, given what happened. And we'll let this set up, and then I will sand it. And we'll see. Depending on how it sands out, I might have to put another coat on or the sanding itself, because I go up to 1500 grit might be enough. Really all I'm trying to achieve right now is a smooth finish that's not glossy. So this isn't protecting the wood. I'm not worried about any of that. The epoxy's doing that. It's just get a smooth finish and have it look satiny. Okay, so actually this set up really nice. In fact, like a lot better than I expected, given the problems that we had with the sprayer, and then I had to kind of switch real quick and do the brushing. So what I'm going to do right now, my suspicion is that it's actually going to work out pretty good, but we might end up having to do another coat. So I'm going to go over it once with 220, and then I'm actually going to do 320. The only reason I'm grabbing this one for the 320 is I'm out of the 320 sandpaper. Having said that, I do use this one a lot. This is the Makita battery powered, 18 volt battery powered 5-inch orbital sander. And when I just need to do like a quick sand on something or do a corner or whatever, I grab this before I grab this 6-inch one. Because this one I got to plug in and I got to hook up and get the vacuum and do whatever. I know it sounds kind of silly, but I do use this one quite a bit. And if you don't want to spend the money on the big 6-inch one, then these ones are actually pretty reasonable. I'll put a link below to this one, and if you want to get that one or any other one for that matter. Let me show you here really quick. So I just gave this is just with the 220, really light, really fast. And I left the pad super flat and sanded really quick. So you can kind of see right here, there's a mark that's not sanded. That's where the brush stroke was a tiny bit lower. But if you actually look over this whole thing, I've got a pretty uniform sand on it, which actually means I might be able to make this one work. So I'm gonna sand down and try and get rid of that line, and then I'm gonna go over it with the 320 and then wash it and see how it looks. Okay, so yeah, this is actually looking really good. So when I messed up with the sprayer, you saw that when I brushed it on, I actually laid it on there pretty thick. You could tell by how kind of white and everything it was. And my hope was that I could lay on enough of a layer that when I went to sand, by the time I took off the high spots, I would still be left with a layer of this polyurethane. Remember, the only reason I'm putting this polyurethane on was to get rid of the glossy shine of the epoxy. So as long as I don't take it all off and I have the look of the satin, I'm actually happy with that. So what I am going to do now is take my flat pad Makita sander, and I'm going to go over it with 600, then I'm going to go over it with 1500. And by the time I get up to 1500 and go over it uniform, I think I'm going to be at the spot where I want to be in terms of the finish and the quality of what I'm looking for. Okay, so that last polyurethane layer didn't quite work out as well as I had hoped. It was pretty good, but it's not exactly what I wanted. So I would like to spray more polyurethane on, but my sprayer, I need a new one. That's the bottom line. So I'm going to shift gears and actually do something a little bit different. I'm actually going to use this Osmo Poly X oil. It's a really nice finish. I like it. I use it on a number of things. A lot of times when it's going directly on the wood, it really brings out a lot of the character and the shine and everything of the wood. It's about twice the price of polyurethane. It goes on a little bit different, but I like it. Like it's a great product. You basically just want to give it a nice mix, and then I actually roll it on to start, and I do a nice thin. The object with this too, or one of the things that you want to do is make sure to put on a thin layer. It doesn't have to go on very thick. And if you remember, like we've already put epoxy on this. And so I'm not looking to protect the wood. I'm not looking to make the wood waterproof. I'm not even looking to make anything flat. All that's been achieved already with the epoxy. All I want right now is not to have a shiny tabletop and to have a nice matte, smooth tabletop. So the polyurethane was going to do that for me, and then we ended up with the sprayer problem. And now I'm going to shift and use this stuff. So I'm going to lay it on nice and thin. And then I'm going to kind of buff it out afterwards just to get a really nice even coverage over the whole deal. And then we let it dry. It usually wants to dry 8 to 10 hours. And it's a beautiful, nice silky finish. You know, these Germans have got this one figured out. So all I'm going to do, pop the can open. I've already mixed it. I'm going to pour some in my tray here. And I'm not going to like soak the brush. I'm just gonna get kind of a nice even coverage across it. I'm not trying to soak up a ton, but I do want it to be even across this foam roller, because I actually don't want to put a lot on here. Okay, now I'm just going to use this buffing pad and go over everything as much as I need to get a real uniform surface. With that roller, you can still kind of tell that there's a few spots maybe that, you know, like there's a little bump here or there. And so this just helps to kind of level everything out so that when it sets up and dries, it's perfect. Okay, and here's the base with the table top on it. You can see I've distressed just enough that you can kind of see some of the brown showing through, which also kind of matches up with the top. Looks really cool, catches your eye. This top's got a nice satin finish.